All right, so Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all. So let's look at what we did yesterday, and then you could see all the scribbling is still left right here with all the different things that we had talked about yesterday. So today, inshallah, what we're going to do, we're actually going to be going over Tafseer al-Qurtubi. So all of these things, we did them yesterday. And we're going to go to Tafsir al-Qurtubi in order to talk about the details. And let's see, إنما يستجيب الذين يسمعون. We didn't go over Tafsir al-Qurtubi with these ayat, so let's actually look into these ayat, right? إنما يستجيب الذين يسمعون. The ones that would respond to the call of faith would be the ones that are actually hearing this, in hearing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَالْمَوْتَ يَبْعَثُهُمُ اللَّهُ ثُمَّ إِلَيْهِ يُرْجَعُونَ. Yet the ones that are dead would be the ones that would be resurrected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then they would return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was a very horrible translation, but because that's word by word, wasn't actually accurate in the meaning. So let's say right there, hold on. Here we go. So إنما يستجيب الذين يسمعون, meaning that the ones that would respond to the call are the ones that were capable of hearing it. But we did actually say that there's a difference between يسمعون and يستمعون. And we said that what this is in يستمعون really means to have tentative listening. But this ayah within this context, it didn't necessarily say يستمعون, meaning having tentative listening, but it went in a way to present that those that they couldn't even hear it, they're the ones that, or the ones that had just heard it, and even if they were really to just give just the slight ability, the slight attention, the slightest attention to hearing the words of the Quran, they would have actually responded to the words of truth. Okay, so this is important to keep in mind when we speak of the word يسمعون and يستمعون. Off topic. In fiqh, it's a little off topic, but I think it's worthy of mention. In fiqh, there is a chapter called Kitab al-Sama'. Kitab al-Sama'. You would usually think that the word as-sama', that this is involving hearing, listening, etc., but what it's actually talking about, it's talking about music. Okay, so it's talking about music, the ruling on music, the ruling on nasheed, the ruling on basically instruments, etc., and it goes in detail. So when you look at Kitab al-Sama', this is what it's actually talking about. Like I said, a little off topic, but I thought it would be worthy of mentioning right here. وَالْمَوْتَى يَبْعَثُهُمُ اللَّهُ, and the ones that are dead, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would resurrect them. Now, within this context, when you say إنما يستجيب الذين يسمعون والموتى يبعثهم الله ثم إليه يرجعون, is this an informative clause? Because we already know in other ayat that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to resurrect them. So why repeat it? It wasn't an informative clause. This is إنما يستجيب الذين يسمعون. The ones that really respond are the ones that would hear the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And now the inference is al-mawta yab'athuhum Allah. The inference is, well, the dead, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would resurrect them. This is to basically give an inference that the real ones to hear the words are the ones that actually have life in them. Another inference is that calling it al-mawta actually means, so the cat, okay, the cat is getting to know my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law is just confused about, okay, why is this cat around me? Why is this cat trying to get to know me? She doesn't know what to do about him. But anyhow, so the inference, وَالْمَوْتَى يَبْعَثُهُمُ اللَّهُ ثُمَّ إِلَيْهِ يُرْجَعُونَ. Al-Mawta, within this context, is basically telling us that the ones that would be in contrast to the ones that are yastajib, the ones that would respond to the call would be opposite of the person that is mayyit. Meaning what? Meaning that the person that is answering the call is actually a person of life, is a person, their spirit was awakened. Al-mawta yab'athuhum Allah, and the ones that were dead, meaning the ones that did not hear the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would still not run away from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala held them accountable for, and they would not run away because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would resurrect them in the end. ثُمَّ إِلَيْهِ يُرْجَعُونَ, and then they would return to the Lord Almighty. They would basically have no option but to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if they wanted to refuse to hear the words, they would still have no option of returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَقَالُوا لَوْلَا نُزِّلَ عَلَيْهِ آيَةٌ. Now, يَبْعَثُهُمُ اللَّهُ, before we jump onto that one, يَبْعَثُهُمُ اللَّهُ, is this necessarily talking about al-ba'th, meaning resurrection, day of resurrection, or is this yab'athuhumullah to meaning accountability? Okay, so what is the accountability for? So the accountability meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if they had chosen to not accept the words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would still resurrect them, and in the end they will be held accountable for accepting or rejecting the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَقَالُوا لَوْلَا نُزِّلَ عَلَيْهِ آيَةٌ مِّن رَبِّهِ, and they said, if only the Lord Almighty had sent an ayah. What is an ayah? An ayah is basically the different miracles, the different verses, the different revelations. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us this as really describing how they were really not wanting to search for evidence as much as they were wanting to just reject, not for the sake of lacking evidence, but for the sake of arrogance. And that is the word ta'annut. Ta'annut is arrogance. Okay, so even though they had the evidence that was there, but then this ayah is not here just wanting to tell us, hey, this is what they said and this is the response, but this ayah is describing their arrogance and describing how they refused to see the evidence right before their eyes. They refused to hear the words of the Quran. They refused to see the different miracles before their eyes. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is here describing their arrogance and not necessarily describing it as a something like a history, and just to let you know this is what happened. It's not an issue of letting you know history, but there's an informative piece to it, and there's also that inference that describes their arrogance. وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Most of them do not know. What do you mean what most of them do not know? What does that even mean? Let's see. When you say what قُلْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ قَادِرٌ عَلَى أَن يُنَزِّلَ آيَةً, say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of revealing and sending down different ayat. So here's the thing. If you say yunazzil, that does not mean reveal. because yunazzil actually means to send down. Okay? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of sending down an ayah. So making this ayah actually letting us know that the most important miracle that the Prophet ﷺ had come with is actually the Quran, and not the materialistic miracles. And they were saying still, لولا نزل عليه. So they too were actually wanting miracles to be sent down, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of sending down miracles, but most of them لا يعلمون. Most of them do not even recognize the miracles, and most of them do not even connect those pieces. Remember when we talked about that Islam and fiqh and the different things in Islam, it's like a thread connecting the quilts and pieces of quilt together. That's exactly what the Quran was trying to say in regards to understanding and putting these pieces together. So the ayah was saying, وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. In other words, they're not using their tools, the tools that were given to them, whether we're speaking about mental tools, whether we're speaking about the ability to see, the ability to hear, the ability to touch, the ability to relate to, they're not seeing the connection between all of that. So what happens if you're not connecting the things together? In other words, you're not connecting the things that you are seeing, the things that you are hearing, and along with it, the interpretation of what all of this means about life, which is that you're being tested, that there is a purpose to this life, then in that situation, لكن أكثرهم لا يعلمون. They might have seen, they might have probably acquired a PhD in biology and probably even physics and add chemistry on it and etc. They might have actually gone all these degrees in these scientific fields, but if they could not relate and put these pieces together, that there is a purpose out behind all of this sophisticated thing that you are seeing, all of this sophisticated design that you are seeing, that it's basically giving you that interpretation, that indication that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this world for a purpose, and that this world was not created in absurdity. So when the ayah says, وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ, most of them do not know, meaning the interpretation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent with al-wahi to help you understand and explain why this world was created this way. What is this purpose for? What is the purpose for this creation? Where are we heading to? And so forth. So this would be وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Another interpretation, one, of course, is that they don't recognize what benefit and what purpose Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this life for. And then the second one, وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ, the second interpretation said, well, this would actually give the indication that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us most of them don't recognize why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not punishing them instantly for whatever wrong they're doing, but giving them available time and giving that available, let's say, potentials, and making it given by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give you the opportunity to find hidayah. ولكن أكثرهم لا يعلمون, meaning that another interpretation is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that they don't recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of sending down the miracles, is capable of sending the different ayat, etc. But then most of them don't even recognize that what you're seeing, the ayat, are a reflection for you to understand the world around you. وما من دابة في الأرض ولا طائر يطير بجناحيه إلا أمثالكم. It's this ayah was quite interesting. And I said before, Tahir ibn Ashur had mentioned that this ayah was probably one of those ayat that he was finding it hard to put it within the coherence of the ayat that had come before it and the ayat that had come after it and what it really means, and then explained a couple things before, so I'm not going to redo it. Is this talking about ما فرطنا في الكتاب من شيء, therefore everything that was created, whether we're speaking about animals that walk on earth or whether it's the birds, and is this speaking about how everything is basically let's say everything is encompassed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether on earth or whether in space or up above in the skies? Or is this to show that this is not an issue of encompassment per se, as much as it is to show that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically قادر على أن ينزل آية, that he's capable of sending down different ayat, and these are the ayat that you would basically find on earth and also in the skies for you to actually see and witness. So that was another interpretation. Well, let's look into those interpretations and see. What is a deb? We did talk about a deb in Surah Al-Baqarah in details, and we said a deb basically means everything or anything that walks on land, anything that walks on earth is basically called a deb. Another interpretation for deb is any animal or human even, not necessarily walking on earth, but dwelling on earth. It's basically deb. Okay, so when you see right there, that Debba would also mean to walk and have very close steps, very close steps. So in other words, it's not necessarily swimming or flying, but it's actually making as a way for transportation, one leg after another to make it walk, basically. طائر يطير بجناحيه. الطائر is basically the bird. We're speaking about birds. What kind of birds? Because we've got penguins are considered birds. And we have, let's say, all the other birds, peacocks, birds. Some birds fly, others don't fly. They just basically, they can fly just a short distance, but not long distances. And you have other birds, they would fly long distances. And the world of birds is quite interesting. You would usually think it's just one bird, but, I find it fascinating to look at how birds each create a different home. This one, the way that they would make their homes and their nests are probably the most things that I find fascinating. How they make those nests and how they would make an entrance door and an exit door, and some would actually collect it in a way to make it round and long, and others would make it in just an open space, and others would make it in based on the territory. It's quite interesting, subhanAllah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us know that just by looking at the fascination, the fascination, and just by looking at the creation that surrounds us, whether in the birds, the animals, the trees, etc., all of these different things are actually in them is the miracle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the evidence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all magnificent. Okay, let's see. When you're talking about bijanahay, so what does the ayah say? وَلَا طَائِرٍ يَطِيرُ بِجَنَاحَيْهِ إِلَّا أُمَمٌ أَمْثَالُكُمْ. So why did it emphasize on the wings? What is al-janah? Al-janah is basically a wing. Janahay are two wings. And why speak about الدابة and the طائر يطير بجناحيه? Why talk about طائر يطير بجناحيه? Why not just talk about طائر and just say, well, you got a دابة and you have طيور and they're أمم أمثالكم. But why specifically say الطائر يطير بجناحيه. Why be so descriptive and detailed in the word and say a bird that flies with two wings? And why that? So let's see what al-Qurtubi had said. First of all, he said il-janah was more metaphorical in order to express and help us see that what's actually here giving us another miracle to see is that how this bird was created in a way, and these wings were basically to create a balance, and how this balance, whether the balance that some animals would use in order to walk on earth, or whether the balance was using the wings, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates different ways of balance. Creates different ways of balance, and therefore recognizing the different ways of balance despite the different methods for survival. At the end, everything in another ayah, ما يمسكهن إلا الله, they're only held by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that these birds or these animals at the end, they're basically getting the balance not necessarily only by their anatomy, but it's actually coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's quite interesting because, you know, I'm going to take you to other ayat right there. You know, the other ayat are taking us into something similar. It's telling us, well, the people that are rejecting and they would forget about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We talked about this yesterday. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says we're going to basically punish them with ba'sa, with poverty, with illnesses, mental illnesses, physical illnesses, all these things. But then despite the ayah telling us that that's what's going to happen, then it says, when they had forgotten what they had basically been reminded of, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala فتحنا عليهم أبواب كل شيء. Here's a confusing thing. How is it فتحنا عليهم أبواب كل شيء when I thought that was for the believers? So why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give more bounties to someone that's rejecting him? At the same time, quite confusing when the ayah, for example, about the mu'mineen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says something similar. وَلَوْ أَنَّ أَهْلَ الْقُرَىٰ آمَنُوا وَاتَّقَوْا لَفَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ بَرَكَاتٍ مِّنَ السَّمَاءِ وَالْأَرْضِ. In Surah Al-A'raf. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says also in Surah Al-Nahl, مَنْ عَمِلَ صَالِحًا مِّن ذَكَرٍ أَوْ أُنثَىٰ وَهُوَ مُؤْمِنٌ فَنُحْيِيَنَّهُ حَيَاةً طَيِّبَةً. So here's a question. You could say that the believers, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that He's going to give them more bounties too. And at the same time, for the disbelievers, فَلَا تُعْجِبُكَ أَمْوَالُهُمْ وَلَا أَوْلَادُهُمْ إِنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيُعَذِّبَهُم بِهَا فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. Here we go. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving more for the kafirin as well. فَلَمَّا نَسُوا مَا ذُكِّرُوا بِهِ فَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ أَبْوَابَ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. When they had forgotten everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had reminded them of, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He opened up everything for them. So, you know, so opened up for the kafirin and opened up for the mu'mineen in rizq and provisions. How do we understand and how do we connect these two pieces together? So one, just by having wealth and just by having different successes, perhaps, yes, more higher income, perhaps maybe good health, maybe more homes, maybe all these different things, you've got it available, but just because you have it, it does not necessarily reflect success, and certainly does not necessarily reflect that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is content over you. And this is important to keep in mind because it is very common that people or even countries might think, so we have these different things that are showing that we basically are going the right direction. The economy is improving. Perhaps militarily, we're the biggest and the strongest. And perhaps politically, we're right now anything we want, we can just impose it and we could get it. That doesn't necessarily mean that you had reached success and that this is going to give you stability. Just because you have the money, just because you have the degrees, it does not necessarily mean that you are successful. Just keep that one in mind. Many would think, I've got the money, I've got the degrees, that means I'm successful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling us that no, these are tools. Money, degrees, marriage, kids, houses, cars, whatever it is, these are tools. The mu'min and how he relates to these tools is different than how a kafir relates to the tools. Meaning what? If you look at the ayah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically says, فَلَا تُعْجِبُكَ أَمْوَالُهُمْ وَلَا أَوْلَادُهُم. This is key. Do not be impressed and fascinated by their wealth or the number of their children, for the Lord Almighty is intending to لِيُعَذِّبَهُمْ بِهَا فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. But it's actually to give them more punishment, more pain in this life. Wait a minute. Everybody is after money and children and homes and cars and all these different things as tools to happiness. How is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us لِيُعَذِّبَهُم? Well, that's because going back to the key thing that we were talking about, the availability of money, availability of these tools, degrees, whatever it is, that availability in itself is a tool. If this tool was used right, that's what leads you to success. What is the success? Success is وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Then the ayah continues, مَا أُرِيدُ مِنْهُم مِّن رِزْقٍ وَمَا أُرِيدُ أَن يُطْعِمُونَ. What to announce? إِنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ الرَّزَّاقُ ذُو الْقُوَّةِ الْمَتِينُ. What does that mean? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the only reason, the only object to creating the human beings and the jinn is basically in order to test them and test their commitment and their submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was the main thing. ما أريد منهم من رزق. I don't need not the rizq, not the provisions, not the wealth, none of that. And I don't want them to somehow think that they are responsible for somehow just making money for the sake of making money. What then should we be doing? And inna Allah huwa razzaqu dhul quwwati al-mateen. I want you to testify and recognize that your Lord Almighty, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the one that brings in the provisions and dhul quwwati al-mateen. And He is the mighty powerful one. So therefore, the implication of all of this, rizq itself is not necessarily provisions and wealth. They're not necessarily a reflection of success, but they're a reflection of perhaps the success in getting the tools, but not necessarily still. Because you could have probably taken the money in a way that is not lawful. Number two, just because you have these tools, it doesn't mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is content over you. Number three, not everyone that has these tools is necessarily loved and embraced and accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For even the disbeliever, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might send provisions and give, let's say, these keys in order to test the person. And perhaps it is to let them get more into the fitna that they're in. Why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala get them more, deeper into the fitna? Is He the one that's getting them deeper into the fitna? Why hold them accountable if He's the one that put them in the fitna? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are two things. I want you to look at this one. There is, when we're speaking about, let's write that down. Okay, there is two kinds of irada, two kinds of will that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had decreed and ordained in this world. Number one, there is irada tashri'iyya, and there's irada kawniyya. What does that mean? There is a will that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created within nature. That does not mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created within this nature. You work hard, the earth has no choice but to present based on the amount of hard work that you put in. That's what earth was basically ordered to do. Yes, the earth was ordered to give you rizq based on the amount that you would contribute. Think of it as a vending machine. Think of it as a vending machine. You put an amount of money, and then the vending machine was designed to give you this and that order. Same thing. The earth was designed, you figure out the keys to understanding soil, to understanding temperature, to understanding perhaps humidity, the amount of water, minerals, the type of minerals, etc. You figure that out. The earth will say, you figured me out. Okay, now you figured out the coding of that earth. The earth has no option but to serve based on how you understood the coding and would give you that amount. Yet, whether we're speaking about earth as an example, and definitely not exclusive to that, or whether we're speaking about health, or whether we're speaking about wealth, economy, everything that you see in this world runs off a certain system. Runs off a certain system. You figure it out. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically give you more of that because that's how nature was designed. Yet, just because you figured out the coding to making earth produce more, it does not necessarily mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is accepting it. That's an irada tashri'iyya. That's the legislating will. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا يَرْضَى لِعِبَادِهِ الْكُفْرِ. And the Lord Almighty would not will disbelief for His servants. So that's to connect the things that we were talking about earlier. Just because you figured out the coding and the earth is giving you more, that does not necessarily mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is accepting it. Now, what's going to make a difference? What's going to make a difference is that how a believer would relate to the legislating will, how they would relate to the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's going to determine whether this provision was a niqmah or a ni'mah. Wait, what was the word again? Niqmah or ni'mah. Let me write that down. Niqmah or ni'mah. Look at that. The one with the qaf would mean that it is nothing but a retaliation and nothing but a punishment. The other one, ni'mah, it's a blessing. Just one letter makes a completely different meaning. Niqmah or ni'mah is the provision. Was this tool that I got, was this coming in my favor or against my favor? Well, how and what determines that? One, your intention. For the believer, basically would give in order to gain more social status, arrogance. For a believer, on the other hand, they would give, contribute, whether in the effort or in the wealth, in order to basically increase in their submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And with that, they're basically getting that reward. The implication for the believer, if they were to go perhaps in a way that instead of getting more of that good, they basically had lost it, maybe lost the job, maybe lost a loved one, etc. What is the implication? Well, they recognize that it was coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not necessarily just their effort, because they recognize that the coding that was designed in on earth or in earth was basically from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they recognize that it's not their effort that brought the provision, but it's basically the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah al-Waqi'ah. Let's go to Surah al-Waqi'ah for a bit because it relates to this one. Should we go to Surah al-Waqi'ah for a bit? Let's go to Surah al-Waqi'ah. Let's just remember the page that we're on, 141. Okay, let's go to Surah al-Waqi'ah really quick. Hopefully we can find it. Mumtahana. So let's go up really. Okay, here we go. If this is Surah al-Rahman, Surah al-Waqi'ah is here. Let's look at this one. ثم إنكم أيها الضالون المكذبون لآكلون من شجر من زقوم فمالئون منها البطون فشاربون. Hold on. This one from here. هذا نزلهم يوم الدين. From here. نحن خلقناكم فلولا تصدقون. We had created you, but of course, many of you, and if only you had believed and you had basically embraced the truth of it. أفرأيتم ما تمنون. So right there, there's a colon. So it's telling you, well, are you the one that created yourself? No. Okay. Since you didn't create yourself, well, let's look at what perhaps you would say, well, I wasn't there. So you know the answer to this question, that you know the answer that I didn't create myself. Says, okay, fine. Let's go for an argument two. What you ejaculate for the man, the semen, are you the one that creates that? Or is it that the Lord Almighty created that? It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that creates it. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, okay, now maybe the first one was hard for you to answer because you considered that the argument was, you know that I didn't create myself. So fair enough, I'll go for question two. That semen, do you make it into a human being? No, you don't. What is that to tell you? The inference, that's to tell you that, well, if you didn't create yourself and you didn't create what is within perhaps something easier, maybe within your ability, what you can probably touch, sense, etc. Are you the one that makes this turn into a human being? No. Okay, maybe that was too challenging for you as well. Let's go for stage 3 in the question. نحن قدرنا بينكم الموت وما نحن مسبوقين على أن نبدل أمثالكم وننشئكم فيما لا تعلمون. Stage 3 was basically to tell you, well, now that you recognize that you did not create, and you recognize that you don't have the power to give life to something, then that comes to letting us understand the theme, نحن قدرنا بينكم الموت. Now you recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was the one that set and ordained death. Why not say ordained life? Because this, you already had recognized that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ordained life because He had created you. Now you see that He had ordained life. So if He was the one that ordained life, then He is the one that is going to ordain the end of life. وَمَا نَحْنُ بِمَسْبُوقِينَ. And there's no way that this is going to be hard on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because you had seen that He already had created you the first time. Why would it be hard to recreate you again? على أن نبدل أمثالكم وننجئكم فيما لا تعلمون. Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically capable bringing you to death and bringing another nation instead of you. And that nation would make use of the privilege of life. وَلَقَدْ عَلِمْتُمُ النَّشْأَةَ الْأُولَى فَلَوْلَا تَذَكَّرُونَ. Now that you recognize the first time that you were created, you recognize how you were at one point not existent, and now you're existent, and now you're living, and now you're eating, drinking, and you're basically right there, full of life. Why would you think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not capable of making this happen again? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَوْلَا تَذَكَّرُونَ. If only you would just remember, connect the dots together, and just figure out the common sense within all of this. Let's go for another matter. So in the first one was basically talking about creation. In the second one said, okay, the same idea. If you didn't bring life, well, are you the one that sustains it? So he goes, أَفَرَأَيْتُم مَا تَحْرُثُونَ. Do you see what you harvest and what you plant? Are you the one that actually gives it the ability to grow and produce and all of that? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, just so you would recognize that you're not the one that actually makes the plant grow. You just plant the seed and the seed works itself out. It's not it works itself out. It's actually that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically given that seed a number of different coatings within it in order to figure out what is needed when the different tools are available. But that would not have been possible if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't put in a certain DNA, a certain coding, a certain RNA, whatever it is, that's basically determining how the plant, how earth, how animals, how different things would basically recognize what the function should look like. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَوْ نَشَاءُ لَجَعَلْنَاهُ حُطَامًا. If we had wanted, we would have just made all of those crops basically become nothing but a whole debris, a whole set of nothing but dried plants right there. فَظَلْتُمْ تَفَكَّهُونَ. And then you would be so angry and what happened? Why did I lose my crops? إِنَّا لَمُغْرَمُونَ. For the Lord Almighty is capable of removing and taking away all the rizq that was given to you. And then what happens? Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ الْمَاءَ الَّذِي تَشْرَبُونَ. Do you see now that we're speaking about livelihood, we're talking about food, in here, vegetation. Okay, let's go for the other thing, the water that you drink. Are you the one that sends it from the clouds, or is it Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that one that sends it from the clouds? This water, you're capable of drinking from it, but the Lord Almighty would have been capable of making this water, but nothing but salty water, and then therefore you wouldn't be able to drink from it. So then, فَلَوْلَا تَشْكُرُونَ, if only basically you were thankful for what you had basically received from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's provision. But this was quite interesting. أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ النَّارَ الَّتِي تُورُونَ, do you see the fire that you would light? The fire, why get into fire? Because that's energy. Fire itself is energy. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, are you the one that created the trees to make energy, or is it Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? But then, when he talked about أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ النَّارَ الَّتِي تُورُونَ, he didn't say, well, أَفَلَا تَشْكُرُونَ, what are you going to do with it? But he just said, نَحْنُ جَعَلْنَاهَا تَذْكِرًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made that fire be a reminder. A reminder of what? Something to relate to on Judgment Day that's going to look very similar to what you see. وَمَتَاعًا لِلْمُقْوِينَ. And it's also something that would benefit those that are in need, those that need to probably use some energy, some heat in order to basically learn and use the different provisions that were given to them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then announces, فَسَبِّحْ بِاسْمِ رَبِّكَ الْعَظِيمِ. So now, فَسَبِّحْ. Now that you recognize the magnificence of the Lord Almighty, then what you need to do, فَسَبِّحْ بِاسْمِ رَبِّكَ الْعَظِيمِ. Take that minute to announce one thing, which is that the Lord Almighty, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that your Lord Almighty is basically the one that is the magnificent one to be in full control of all of this. So how is that related to the ayah that we were doing? The way that it's related, you could see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us that the way that things run, whether we're speaking about their creation or the function in reproduction, in flying, in eating, in drinking, whatever it is, it was designed in its detail by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ما فرطنا في الكتاب من شيء. Nothing goes out of al-kitab. And now that one would recognize that the ni'mah and the niqmah, the different basically blessings, it would be for a believer a blessing because they would recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is truly controlling. What would make a difference for the servant? They would recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what they want to connect to in order to be thankful. For the disbeliever, they would not see that this was a result of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent, and they would see it as a result of what they had done. So then you would see an increase in mental illness when things don't go right, because they would consider that they had failed. For a mu'min does not know this type of hopelessness, because they would recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to control the different things, and all I need to do is work harder, whether in figuring things out or work harder in basically making things function in a way to give me whether more or give me better, or probably give me longer life, or whatever it is, or health, etc. So for a mu'min, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us that for a mu'min, وَلَوْ أَنَّ أَهْلَ الْقُرَىٰ آمَنُوا وَاتَّقَوْا لَفَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ بَرَكَاتٍ. For a believer, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said He would open barakah. He would open blessings. But for the disbelievers, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said that فَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ أَبْوَابَ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. They'll have everything in huge abundance, large amounts. But أخذناهم بغتة, the second that they disregard Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and consider that the provisions that they have with them are basically as a result of their hard work, not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being الرزاق ذو القوة المتين. What is the end result? فإذا هم مبلسون. The end result? Let's look at that ayah. What is the end result of all of this? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us فإذا هم مبلسون. What they're going to be suffering from is مبلسون. It's mental illness and depression. Mental illness and depression is basically what al-mublis is. So how is that related to the wind and related to the bird's wings? So one thing, the word wing is indeed, it's nothing but a wing. The words that use, in other words, it's literally the wings. But is it here giving me the inference that what creates balance, whether we're speaking about animals or whether we're speaking about birds or whether we're speaking about the different nations, etc., that in order to create a balance, you would basically have to go for al-irada tashri'iyya. Just because things in nature are serving you, your duty is to basically serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in legislation, and therefore that's what would create a balance as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created balance on earth, whether it's animals or whether it's bird. Even if this bird was to fly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would still create a way to make a balance. What is that supposed to let us know? That the legislation or the irada tashri'iyya was there in order to complete al-irada al-kawniyya. Let's do it again. Al-irada tashri'iyya was to complete al-irada al-kawniyya, or the will that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in nature is basically supposed to be serving the legislating will, and the legislating will, along with the will within nature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, that's what creates the balance that you would find in birds or the balance that you would find in life. That's why if a person may have irada kawniyya, they're so good, they just figured out how to make money, they figured out everything, and the legislating part, they're disregarding it. That's when il-janah becomes ma'al. That's when that wing basically gives an imbalance. So what do I need? I need that wing to help me get stronger in figuring out dunya. And I also need the other wing to balance it with the legislating will to make sure that I'm gliding right in this world. Okay, that's why in Arabic we would say janahati safina, and that's why we would say junah. What is il junah? Not janah. Il junah. Il junah is basically that transgression. What is a transgression? A transgression is basically when there is an imbalance between the tools that you got in this dunya and the responsibility and the legislating will that basically was supposed to give you that balance. If the person is not balancing these two, dunya and akhirah, then their life is going to be nothing but ruined. And therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said ثُمَّ إِلَىٰ رَبِّهِمْ يُحْشَرُونَ, and they would basically be held accountable. And the inference to this is more of tahdeed. This is more of a threat that they would be resurrected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and held accountable. إِلَّا أُمَمٌ أَمْثَالُكُمْ. It's quite interesting. Within this ayah, so yes, it talked about the animals and basically said that they're very similar to you in many ways. So let's see what here. How are they similar to us? Number one, they basically come in groups. Yet despite the fact that they come in groups and perhaps invest in a certain area the same way, you would see, for example, the companies that control diamonds, they would usually have, certain families from father, son, great-grandfather, they had all been working within that industry. Same thing. If you were to perhaps look at the companies that are probably running certain types of crops and certain types of plants, etc. All right, you would see the whole company is running the same thing. Okay, but despite all of that, you would see that even in animals, whether we're speaking about the foxes, the wolves, basically walking in a certain line, and the one that's in the forefront is basically the leader, and then same thing, you would see they're walking in flocks, whether it's elephants, birds, etc. There is this pattern that is there existent for us to see as human beings and to recognize that this instinct or the coding within the DNA, even in the plants, even in the animals, even in the different types of animals and so forth, is basically designed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when he says umamun amthalukum, meaning they're creatures just like you, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had still basically guaranteed or taken care of their own rizq, their own provisions, and he would adala alayhim. He would basically be just in between them, so therefore they would not exceed the limit. Okay, it is 11:03. Inshallah, tomorrow we will continue this. Sorry, I'm actually getting exhausted, but inshallah, tomorrow we'll continue this, and hopefully, inshallah, I'll just draw this line. Hopefully, inshallah, tomorrow we'll also be doing more, but sorry, I'm pretty exhausted from yesterday. But inshallah, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. I don't see any questions. Okay. Oh, is there? Okay. If you would like to unmute yourself, that would also be okay. All right. So inshallah, we'll see you all tomorrow. Subhanakallahumma